New York City, 1907. Panic grips Wall Street as America's financial system teeters on the edge of collapse. Banks are failing by the hour. Crowds of desperate people line the streets, fighting to withdraw their life savings before it all disappears. But inside a magnificent library on Madison Avenue, a very different scene unfolds. The most powerful bankers in America sit nervously around an ornate table. The room falls silent as a commanding figure with piercing eyes and an imposing presence enters. His nose, bulbous and red from a skin condition, does nothing to diminish his aura of absolute authority. This is J.P. Morgan, and he's about to do something extraordinary. "Gentlemen," Morgan announces, fighting back a cough as he surveys the room. "No one leaves until we save the American economy." With that single action, locking the door and forcing the nation's financial elite to cooperate, one man will rescue an entire nation from economic ruin. How did it come to this? How did the United States of America, a democracy founded in opposition to concentrated power, find itself at the mercy of a single private citizen? This is the story of J.P. Morgan, the man who owned America, a man who controlled more wealth than the U.S. government itself, a man who could build empires with a handshake or destroy them with a word. And it all began with a sickly boy who was once exiled to a remote island in the Atlantic Ocean. Power. Few have wielded it as completely as John Pierpont Morgan. At the height of his influence, this banker's personal decisions shaped the destiny of the United States more directly than most presidents. This wasn't just wealth, this was unprecedented economic dominance. While today's billionaires control vast fortunes, Morgan controlled something far more valuable: the financial architecture of an emerging superpower. At his peak, J.P. Morgan controlled more wealth than the U.S. government itself, and when America faced economic collapse, it wasn't Washington that saved the day, it was Morgan. The numbers are staggering. He owned 1/3 of America's railroads when they were the nation's economic backbone. He created the world's first billion-dollar company when most businesses were worth mere thousands. He saved the U.S. Treasury not once, but twice, deploying his personal fortune to stabilize a nation in crisis. When Morgan spoke, markets moved. When he acted, industries transformed overnight. A single man with a disfigured nose and piercing gaze held the financial fate of millions in his hands. But Morgan's story isn't just about accumulating wealth, it's about the transformation of America itself. Through his ruthless consolidation of industries and financial institutions, he helped shape modern capitalism as we know it. His vision of organized, efficient business empires replaced the chaotic competition of the past, building the foundations for America's global economic dominance in the 20th century. Yet his extraordinary power came at a personal and national price that we're still calculating today. So how did a sickly, privileged boy become the most influential private citizen in American history? How did one banker gain such control that presidents sought his approval and competitors trembled at his approach? And what does Morgan's legacy tell us about the nature of power itself? This is the story of how J.P. Morgan came to own America, and how America was forever changed by one man's ambition. Chapter 1. The Forging of a Titan, Connecticut, 1837. John Pierpont Morgan enters the world as the heir to privilege, born not just with a silver spoon, but with a banker's ledger already bearing his name. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, a successful banker himself, had mapped out his son's future from birth. John would become a financial titan. But fate had other plans, at least initially. While other children played and explored, young Pierpont suffered. His body, seemingly at war with itself, was ravaged by a relentless parade of ailments. Violent coughing fits that left him gasping for air, migraines that blinded him with pain, seizures that terrorized his family, and the burning fever of scarlet rheumatic disease that kept him confined indoors. The sickly boy's childhood became a series of rooms, libraries instead of playgrounds, tutors instead of friends. While his peers developed social bonds, Morgan developed something else: an unusual intimacy with financial statements, a precocious understanding of markets, and a solitary self-reliance that would later become his trademark. His health was failing, but his mind was being forged into something extraordinary: a calculator of risk, an instrument of financial precision. When most children were learning basic arithmetic, Morgan was already studying the complex mathematics of banking. Then came a decision that would change everything. At his breaking point physically, Morgan's father made a remarkable choice. He sent his ailing teenage son alone to the Azores, remote islands in the middle of the Atlantic. No family, no familiar faces, just ocean air and isolation. For nearly a year, Morgan lived in this exile, with only his thoughts and the occasional correspondence from home. Most parents would consider this abandonment. Junius Morgan considered it an investment in his son's future. The gamble paid off. The salty Atlantic air did what doctors could not, strengthening his lungs and hardening his resolve. More importantly, it taught young Morgan something essential: survival depends on self-reliance. By 1857, the newly strengthened 19-year-old Morgan had completed an education spanning Boston, Switzerland, and Germany. Thanks to his father's connections, he secured a position on Wall Street at a banking firm handling his father's American interests. His assignment was simple but crucial: to monitor and report on America's emerging markets. But Junius Morgan remained concerned about his son's temperament. The elder Morgan feared John's rash decisions and hot temper would doom his financial career. This fear seemed justified in 1859 when John made an unauthorized gamble, using company money to purchase an entire shipment of Brazilian coffee that had arrived without a buyer. Though the bold move ultimately turned a profit, the risk had been enormous. The incident confirmed what many suspected. Morgan was not content to simply follow rules. He intended to make them. In 1861, at just 24, Morgan broke from the safety of established firms to found his own company. It was a declaration of independence, though one still tethered to his father's influence, as the new venture continued representing his father's London bank. That same year brought what should have been his greatest joy: marriage to his first love, Amelia Sturgis. But happiness proved cruelly brief. Amelia's persistent cough was soon diagnosed as tuberculosis. Desperate to save her, Morgan took her on an extended Mediterranean honeymoon, hoping the climate might restore her health just as the Azores had saved him. The parallel was painfully ironic. What had healed the husband could not save the wife. Just 4 months after their wedding, Amelia was gone, leaving Morgan a widower before his 25th birthday. The grief that followed was all-consuming, a devastation that friends feared might destroy him. But Morgan responded in a way that would become his lifelong pattern. He channeled emotional pain into relentless work. While mourning privately, he drove himself publicly toward greater financial achievements, as if success might somehow fill the void left by Amelia's death. When the Civil War erupted around him, Morgan saw not just national tragedy, but opportunity. Rather than fight, he paid $300 for a substitute to take his place in the army, a common but controversial practice among the wealthy. Instead, he fought his battles in boardrooms, most notoriously financing the purchase of 5,000 obsolete rifles at $3.50 each that were quickly modified and sold back to the desperate government for $22 each, a 600% profit margin in wartime. The public was outraged, the government humiliated, but Morgan was unmoved. He had learned what would become his defining lesson: in crisis lies opportunity, and sentiment has no place in business. The sickly boy had become a ruthless man. The stage was now set for Morgan to transform from merely wealthy to truly powerful. And America would never be the same. Chapter 2. The Railroad Empire. 1871 marked a pivotal moment in Morgan's ascent to power. He formed a partnership with Anthony Drexel, one of the nation's leading financiers, establishing Drexel, Morgan & Co., the private banking house that would eventually become simply J.P. Morgan & Co., the foundation of today's banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase. This was no ordinary partnership. While other bankers of the era were content to serve as mere facilitators, connecting investors with opportunities for a modest fee, Morgan had grander ambitions. His growing personal fortune and formidable reputation now allowed him to finance entire ventures himself, and he had already identified the perfect target: America's chaotic railroad system. The railroad landscape of post-Civil War America was unlike any other major industry. While steel had Carnegie and oil had Rockefeller, single dominant figures who had consolidated power, the railroads were a fractured mess of competing companies. Dozens of lines offered nearly identical routes, slashing prices to attract customers and often driving themselves toward bankruptcy in the process. To most observers, this fierce competition represented American capitalism at its most vibrant. But Morgan saw something different: inefficiency, waste, and untapped potential. Where others saw healthy competition, Morgan envisioned a consolidated empire under singular control. His control. Morgan's approach was revolutionary, so distinctive it earned its own term: Morganization. He would identify underfinanced railroad companies struggling to survive, buy them at bargain prices, streamline their operations with ruthless efficiency, and then, most critically, merge them into larger entities that could dominate entire regions. Rather than competing against each other and driving down prices, these consolidated railroads could set whatever rates they wished. The method proved devastatingly effective. One by one, independent railroads fell under Morgan's influence, then into his empire. But what truly set Morgan apart from other financial titans was his approach to ownership. He wasn't content to be a passive investor collecting dividends while others managed his assets. Morgan demanded active control. When railroads approached him for financing, his terms were non-negotiable. He would have the final say in all major decisions. He routinely imposed his own men on corporate boards, reshuffled management teams at will, and personally approved or rejected major business strategies. For Morgan, majority ownership of shares was unnecessary. He found more subtle ways to maintain control through strategic debt holdings and board positions. This wasn't just business. It was power in its purest form. Morgan's consolidation efforts transformed the previously chaotic railroad industry into something more stable and predictable. European investors, once wary of America's volatile rail market, now poured money into Morgan-backed ventures, confident in their security. This influx of capital allowed Morgan to expand his empire further, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of growth and influence. His acquisitions grew increasingly bold, purchasing 250,000 shares of the prestigious New York Central Railroad from William Vanderbilt himself, then underwriting $40 million in bonds, an astronomical sum at the time, to complete the Northern Pacific Railroad. Before long, Morgan controlled 1/3 of America's entire rail network, at a time when railroads constituted 60% of the country's stock market capitalization. The scale of his dominance was unprecedented. The physical presence of the man matched his growing financial power. Morgan's appearance alone commanded attention. His intimidating height, his aggressive manner of speaking, and most notably, his distinctive nose, disfigured by a skin condition called rosacea that inflamed and ruptured blood vessels, making it bulbous and deeply red. Morgan despised being photographed and demanded portraits modify his appearance. According to his grandson, he always ordered artists to fix his nose, making it appear more normal. This vanity revealed a surprising vulnerability in a man otherwise known for his imperviousness to criticism or sentiment. Yet his startling appearance only enhanced his reputation. When Morgan entered a room, conversation stopped, and the most powerful men in America gave him their complete attention. By 1901, Morgan seemed unstoppable, until he encountered the one man in America with the authority and will to challenge him, President Theodore Roosevelt. Morgan had just created his most ambitious consolidation yet, the Northern Securities Corporation, merging several major railways into one dominant entity. Under the previous administration of William McKinley, such maneuvers had faced little resistance. Morgan and McKinley had maintained a cordial, mutually beneficial relationship. But McKinley's assassination thrust Roosevelt into the presidency, and the new leader took immediate aim at what he viewed as dangerous monopolistic practices. Roosevelt ordered the Justice Department to file suit against Northern Securities for violating antitrust laws, initiating a legal battle that would ultimately force the company's dissolution. The confrontation marked the beginning of a bitter antagonism between the two most powerful men in America. When Morgan heard Roosevelt was planning an African safari, he remarked with uncharacteristic public venom, "Good. I hope the first lion that meets him does his duty." But despite this setback, Morgan was hardly deterred. He was already planning his next conquest, one that would dwarf everything he had achieved thus far and forever change American industry. The railroad empire had been merely a prelude. Steel would be his masterpiece. Chapter 3. Creating America's First Billion-Dollar Company. 1901. Carnegie Steel stood as the crown jewel of American industry, a manufacturing colossus generating $40 million in annual profits, a sum so vast that few could comprehend its scale. Its founder, Andrew Carnegie, had risen from impoverished immigrant to industrial titan, but now, at the peak of his power, he was ready to step away. Carnegie wanted to retire, to dedicate himself to philanthropy, but first, he needed someone to take his life's work off his hands. The question was, who on earth could afford to buy the most valuable company in America? On a winter day in New York, Carnegie met with Morgan in what would become one of the most consequential business meetings in history. No stenographers recorded their conversation, no witnesses observed the negotiation, but what transpired would transform the American economy forever. When Carnegie finally named his price, $480 million, Morgan didn't hesitate, didn't counter, didn't flinch. "I accept this price," he replied, without a moment's deliberation. The deal was sealed with nothing more than a handshake, a gentleman's agreement that would be worth billions in today's money. Later, Morgan would confess that he would have willingly paid $100 million more, a revelation that reportedly caused Carnegie to remark that he should have asked for more. But purchasing Carnegie Steel was just the first move in Morgan's grand design. With this acquisition as his foundation, Morgan engineered a series of mergers that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. He combined Carnegie Steel with Federal Steel and several smaller steel companies to create an entity of unprecedented scale, United States Steel. On March 2, 1901, U.S. Steel became the world's first billion-dollar corporation, with a market capitalization of $1.4 billion, roughly 7% of America's entire gross domestic product at the time. To understand the scale, the combined value of all manufacturing companies in America was only $9 billion. With a single business deal, Morgan had created a company that controlled nearly two-thirds of American steel production. The creation of U.S. Steel represented something fundamentally new in American capitalism: the emergence of truly massive corporations that transcended not just industries, but the economy itself. Morgan had demonstrated that there was no theoretical limit to how large a corporation could grow, no ceiling to consolidation, and he didn't stop with railroads and steel. Morgan recognized earlier than most that electricity would transform American life, and he provided crucial financing for Thomas Edison's early experiments. But true to form, Morgan wasn't content to simply fund innovation. He wanted to control it. When Edison's company faced competition, Morgan orchestrated mergers that eventually created General Electric, another corporate titan that continues to dominate today. The telecommunications industry felt Morgan's transformative touch as well. His financial backing and strategy helped shape what would eventually become AT&T, laying the groundwork for yet another American monopoly. In industry after industry, Morgan's approach was consistent. Identify fragmented markets with multiple competing firms, consolidate them into larger entities, install his trusted associates in key positions, and create structures that would maximize both efficiency and his personal control. The pattern became so familiar that businessmen would joke nervously whenever Morgan showed interest in their industry. Consolidation was surely coming. The results of Morgan's consolidation strategy were undeniable. American industrial efficiency increased dramatically. Waste was eliminated as competing factories were integrated into single systems. The economies of scale created by these massive corporations allowed for standardization of products and processes. The chaotic, often brutal competition of the 19th century gave way to a more ordered, predictable economic landscape. America was being transformed from a nation of small, independent businesses into one dominated by corporate giants, with Morgan as the master architect of this transformation. Yet even as Morgan's corporate empire expanded, storm clouds were gathering. The unprecedented concentration of economic power in a few private hands was raising alarm across the political spectrum. Progressive reformers questioned whether any private citizen should control so much of the nation's wealth and industrial capacity. Labor unions fought against the declining power of workers in these giant corporations. And ordinary Americans increasingly wondered if the promise of opportunity was being crushed beneath the weight of these new monopolies. Morgan himself seemed indifferent to these concerns. When questioned about his power, he famously replied, "I owe the public nothing." In his view, his consolidations brought efficiency, stability, and progress. The concentration of power was simply the necessary price for these benefits. Morgan believed that a handful of capable men like himself could manage the economy more effectively than the chaotic forces of open competition. But this philosophy would soon be tested by a crisis that threatened to bring the entire American economy crashing down. A crisis that would force Morgan to decide whether his ultimate loyalty was to his own interests or to the nation itself. Chapter 4. The Man Who Saved America. Twice 1893. Panic swept through America like wildfire. After decades of unchecked growth and rampant speculation, the economic bubble had finally burst. The stock market plummeted, losing nearly half its value virtually overnight. Bank after bank displayed the dreaded closed sign on their doors. In cities across America, ordinary citizens, factory workers, teachers, shopkeepers, lined up desperately outside financial institutions, hoping to withdraw their life savings before it all disappeared. For many, it was already too late. James Wilson, a Pittsburgh steelworker, arrived at his bank to find it surrounded by police. His family's entire savings, $842 earned through years of dangerous labor, had vanished. Stories like his multiplied by the thousands. The crisis deepened as foreign investors, once eager to profit from America's explosive growth, now raced to cash in their American bonds for gold. With each passing day, America's gold reserves, the foundation of its currency, dwindled alarmingly. The United States had always maintained at least $100 million in gold reserves to back the dollar and maintain international credibility. But by early 1895, that figure had plummeted to a catastrophic $9 million. The government was weeks, perhaps days, from defaulting on its loans. If that happened, the American dollar would collapse, and with it, any hope of quick recovery. President Grover Cleveland watched helplessly as the nation spiraled toward an abyss from which it might never return. In this moment of national peril, a telegram arrived at the White House. Request meeting regarding Treasury situation. Arriving tomorrow. J.P. Morgan. The banker traveled to Washington, carrying not just financial plans but the fate of a nation. The meeting between President Cleveland and Morgan was tense, fraught with the weight of impending disaster. Morgan laid out his audacious rescue plan. He would form a private syndicate of the nation's most powerful bankers, who, together with European investors, would provide the gold needed to shore up America's reserves. The syndicate would purchase $65 million worth of 30-year gold bonds using 3.5 million ounces of gold, effectively creating a private bailout of the United States government. Cleveland faced an impossible choice. Accepting Morgan's offer meant acknowledging that the American government could not solve its own crisis, that it needed to be rescued by private bankers who would, inevitably, profit from the arrangement. Refusing meant almost certain economic collapse. After hours of deliberation, Cleveland made his decision. Thanks to an obscure Civil War statute, he could authorize the deal without congressional approval, and he did. Morgan immediately wired his associates in New York, and within 22 minutes, less time than it takes to deliver a speech, they had purchased all the gold bonds. The immediate effect was electric. Market confidence stabilized, the run on gold slowed, and the imminent collapse was averted. Morgan had saved America. But at what cost? The deal, while necessary, had uncomfortable implications. It demonstrated that a single private citizen wielded more financial power than the United States government itself. Democratic politicians denounced the arrangement as plutocracy triumphing over democracy. The American public wondered how their nation had become so dependent on the decisions of one banker. Morgan, characteristically, showed little concern for these criticisms. He had prevented disaster while making a substantial profit in the process, approximately $7 million. In his view, this was simply the market at work. The relationship between government and high finance became a central issue in the 1896 presidential election, with Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan railing against the money powers of the East. But Morgan and his banker allies poured money into Republican William McKinley's campaign, helping secure his victory and maintaining their privileged relationship with government. The crisis had passed, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Yet the true test of Morgan's relationship with America was still to come. In 1907, a new financial panic erupted with even greater ferocity than the last. The trigger was a failed attempt to corner the market on shares of United Copper Company, but the effects rippled outward with terrifying speed. Trust companies, financial institutions similar to banks but less regulated, began failing throughout New York. Soon, traditional banks were infected by the contagion of fear. Once again, crowds gathered outside financial institutions, desperate to withdraw their savings. Bank tellers were instructed to count out money with excruciating slowness to limit withdrawals while messengers raced between banks carrying what little cash remained. The entire American financial system stood on the precipice of complete collapse. This time, Theodore Roosevelt was president, the same Roosevelt who had battled Morgan over railroad consolidation. Their mutual antipathy was well known, but both men recognized that politics must yield to necessity. Roosevelt swallowed his pride and sent word that he would support whatever solution Morgan might devise. Despite being 70 years old and suffering from a severe cold that left him coughing and wheezing, Morgan sprang into action with the vigor of a man half his age. Morgan summoned the nation's leading financiers to his private library on Madison Avenue, the inner sanctum of American capitalism. As night fell, Morgan laid out his strategy. They would create a money pool to provide liquidity to banks that were fundamentally sound but caught in the panic. Some institutions would fail. Morgan was unsentimental about this, but the system as a whole could be saved. After making his proposal, Morgan did something extraordinary. He locked the doors, physically preventing the bankers from leaving until they reached agreement. "This is the place," he told them gravely, "to stop this trouble." Through the night, as Morgan alternated between hard negotiation and fits of coughing, the plan took shape. By morning, the bankers had committed millions of their own money to the rescue fund. With Roosevelt's blessing, the U.S. Treasury contributed $25 million more. Morgan personally decided which institutions would receive support and which would be allowed to fail, in effect, determining the fate of companies and the livelihoods of thousands. He even provided personal funds to the New York Stock Exchange to prevent its collapse. His decisive intervention worked. Within days, the panic began to subside. For the second time in less than 15 years, J.P. Morgan had single-handedly rescued the American economy. Morgan was briefly hailed as a hero. Newspapers that had long criticized him now praised his patriotism and decisiveness. President Roosevelt, no friend to Wall Street, publicly thanked him for his service. But as the immediate crisis faded, a more profound question emerged. Should any private citizen wield this kind of power? The spectacle of one elderly banker making life-or-death decisions for the entire financial system struck many as fundamentally at odds with democratic values. If the American economy had become too complex to manage without Morgan's intervention, perhaps it was time for institutional reform rather than dependence on financial saviors. Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had observed the crisis firsthand, remarked, "Something has got to be done. We may not always have Pierpont Morgan with us to meet a banking crisis." Morgan himself, having now twice pulled the nation back from the brink, recognized the unsustainability of the situation. The American financial system needed structural reform, the kind that would eventually lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Morgan's era of unchecked financial power was drawing to a close, even as his personal legend reached its apex. The man who saved America had also, paradoxically, demonstrated why America needed to be saved from depending on any one man. Chapter 5. The Price of Power. By 1912, J.P. Morgan stood as the most influential private citizen in American history. His financial empire stretched across continents. His decisions shaped industries employing hundreds of thousands. Presidents sought his counsel, and markets rose or fell on his words. Yet beneath this facade of invincibility, Morgan was crumbling. The man who had twice saved the American economy was losing his personal battle with time and scrutiny. His once formidable health was deteriorating rapidly. The nervous breakdowns he had suffered throughout his life increased in frequency and severity. The strain of his position, of being in essence America's unofficial central banker, had exacted a devastating physical and mental toll. Morgan's public image had transformed as well. Once respected if feared, he was now increasingly depicted in political cartoons as a bloated octopus, his tentacles strangling American democracy. Newspapers that had praised his rescue of the economy now questioned whether any democracy could survive with such concentrated private power. The whispers of reform had grown into shouts for regulation. Progressive politicians campaigned explicitly against Morganization and the money trust he represented. For a man accustomed to operating with minimal oversight, this new era of scrutiny was deeply unsettling. The culmination of this shifting tide was the Pujo Committee hearings of 1912, a congressional investigation aimed at exposing what many called the money trust, the network of financial institutions that effectively controlled the American economy. Morgan was summoned to testify, forced to defend his life's work before hostile questioners and a skeptical public. In a packed hearing room, the aging banker faced off against skilled attorney Samuel Untermeyer, who methodically laid bare the extent of Morgan's control over American industry. When asked if his influence extended beyond what was healthy for a democratic nation, Morgan replied with characteristic directness, "I do not know, because I start with the supposition that I do not control anything." The testimony revealed a fundamental difference in worldview. To Morgan, his consolidations had brought order to chaos, efficiency to waste, and stability to volatility. He genuinely believed his actions had strengthened America, not weakened it. But to his critics, Morgan represented a dangerous concentration of power, a financial oligarchy that undermined the very foundation of democracy. Both perspectives contained elements of truth, but the political momentum had decidedly shifted against Morgan's vision of capitalism managed by a few capable men. In a strange twist of fate, Morgan had been scheduled to travel on the Titanic's maiden voyage in April 1912. He had even helped finance the ship's construction. At the last moment, health concerns forced him to cancel his reservation on what would have been his final journey. The man who had survived economic disasters could not have survived that natural one, but the Titanic's sinking became an apt metaphor for the end of an era, the hubris of believing anything could be too big to fail. Morgan never fully recovered from the strain of the Pujo hearings and the public condemnation that followed. On March 31, 1913, while vacationing in Rome, the 75-year-old financier died far from the empire he had built. His death marked the end of an era in American capitalism. Within months of his passing, Congress would pass the Federal Reserve Act, creating the very institution that would assume the emergency functions Morgan had personally fulfilled during financial crises. The legislation was, in many ways, a direct response to the power vacuum created by Morgan's death, an acknowledgement that a modern economy could not depend on the judgment and resources of a single private citizen, no matter how capable. Morgan's son, J.P. Jack Morgan Jr., inherited his father's business, but never his father's dominance. The age of the financial titan giving orders to presidents had passed, yet Morgan's legacy lived on in the institutions he created and the business philosophy he pioneered. His bank continued its expansion through the 20th century, undergoing countless acquisitions and mergers, a strategy Morgan himself would have appreciated. The most significant came in 2000 when J.P. Morgan merged with Chase Bank to create J.P. Morgan Chase, which today stands as the world's largest bank by market capitalization, with assets exceeding $3 trillion. The modern banking colossus bears little resemblance to the private banking house Morgan established, yet it carries forward his fundamental approach to finance: consolidation, efficiency, and strategic influence rather than just profit-seeking. Perhaps most tellingly, during the 2008 financial crisis, J.P. Morgan Chase played a role strikingly similar to Morgan's interventions a century earlier, purchasing failing institutions to stabilize the system, albeit this time with significant government backing. Morgan's personal legacy remains deeply ambiguous. Was he a robber baron who exploited America's resources and workers for personal gain, or a financial visionary whose consolidations built the infrastructure of modern capitalism? Was he a patriot who twice saved his country from economic disaster, or an oligarch whose power threatened democratic governance? The truth, as is often the case with transformative historical figures, encompasses all these contradictions. Morgan was simultaneously America's savior and a symbol of its greatest economic inequities. What remains undeniable is Morgan's central role in transforming America from a chaotic, competitive marketplace of small enterprises into an economy dominated by massive corporations. His vision of an ordered, rationalized capitalist system largely prevailed over the more freewheeling, entrepreneurial model that preceded it. For better or worse, we still live in the world Morgan helped create, a world of global financial institutions, corporate consolidation, and the complex, sometimes troubling relationship between private wealth and public governance. The questions raised by Morgan's career remain urgently relevant today. How much economic power should any private entity control? What happens when corporations become too big to fail? Can democratic governments effectively regulate global financial institutions? Morgan would likely have dismissed these concerns as he dismissed similar ones in his lifetime. But a century after his death, as we continue to grapple with financial crises and corporate power, J.P. Morgan's ghost still haunts the corridors of economic power, reminding us that the tension between private wealth and public good remains unresolved at the heart of modern capitalism. Today, the name Morgan still adorns one of the world's most powerful financial institutions. J.P. Morgan Chase, with its $3 trillion in assets, stands as the culmination of over 200 years of banking consolidation, a process that J.P. Morgan himself pioneered and perfected. Walk through the financial district of any major city, and you'll find Morgan's fingerprints everywhere, in the massive scale of modern corporations, in the interconnected nature of global finance, and in the very structure of American capitalism itself. His vision of an economy dominated by large, efficient, centrally managed corporations has largely triumphed over the chaotic competition he sought to tame. Yet Morgan's story resonates beyond banking boardrooms. It raises fundamental questions about power in a democratic society. Morgan demonstrated that private citizens could amass influence rivaling or exceeding elected governments, a reality that prompted reforms in his era and continues to challenge us today. When modern tech billionaires reshape industries or influence global policy, they follow a path that Morgan blazed. When we debate whether companies have become too big to fail, we're wrestling with the same dilemmas that Morgan's dominance exposed. His career forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Where does private enterprise end and public responsibility begin? Perhaps most striking about Morgan was the duality of his legacy. The same man who manipulated markets for personal profit also risked his fortune to save the nation's economy. The financier who built monopolies that exploited workers also created stability that enabled prosperity. The banker who resisted government regulation helped inspire the creation of essential economic safeguards. Morgan embodied capitalism's most creative and destructive forces simultaneously: its capacity to build magnificent enterprises and its tendency to concentrate power in ways that threaten democratic values. As we navigate our own era of financial innovation, corporate concentration, and economic uncertainty, Morgan's story offers no simple lessons. It instead reminds us that the relationship between private wealth and public good remains as complex and contested today as it was when one man's signature could save or sink the American economy. Morgan's ultimate legacy may be this ongoing tension between the efficiency of consolidated power and the democratic ideal of widely distributed opportunity. The financial titan who shaped America has been gone for over a century, but the fundamental questions his career raised remain unanswered. How much power should any private citizen hold? What responsibilities come with such influence? And can a democratic society reconcile its commitment to equality with the inevitable concentrations of wealth that capitalism produces? As long as these questions persist, J.P. Morgan's shadow will continue to loom large over America's economic landscape, a testament to one man's extraordinary impact on a nation's destiny. Did you find J.P. Morgan's story as fascinating as I do? Hit subscribe to join us for more deep dives into history's most influential figures. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Was Morgan a financial genius or a dangerous monopolist? Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of the titans who built modern America. Thanks for watching.